I just want to say thank you to everybody for inviting me here to moderate tonight. I've never done this before, so I've got some notes here. I know we don't like people using teleprompters, but I'm going to be looking at my notes. So my name is Adam Nicolai. I'm a newly elected director with CD2 and DFL 51. Some of you may have seen me around. I'm part of leadership for IREB, Indivisible Resistance of Egan and Burnsville. And I'm really excited to be here tonight with all of you and with Mr. Painter, who's running as a Democrat for Senate. So for anyone who doesn't know that, to get that out there. I was asked to introduce him, and I can tell you the basics. He's a professor of law at the U of M. He was a White House ethics lawyer in George W. Bush's administration. We're going to be talking about that. He's been very outspoken on the political scene in the last few years, and I'd like to talk about that for a second. The night Donald Trump was elected was one of the most surreal and frightening of my life. I hope there are some people in here who can relate to that. I wish that was hyperbole. It inspired me and many others, I think, to get more involved and do everything we can to make sure the America we know and love survives this administration. It is absolutely my intention to be an impartial moderator tonight, but in the interest of honesty, I have to tell you that in the weeks and months immediately after Trump's election, and frankly ever since, this guy has been a beacon of hope to myself and to many others. He's a Republican never-Trumper who actually meant it, who backed up his claims with evidence regarding emoluments violations and so many of Trump's other crimes, who even took the case to court. It has been deeply refreshing to me to hear a Republican be outspoken in favor of gun control, single-payer health care, and addressing climate change, and I wanted to take a second to thank Mr. Painter personally for that outspokenness. But some of us do feel like all of this is putting the cart before the horse. So having an ally in national media against all the propaganda is one thing, but now he's running as a Democrat for the Senate, hoping to complete the term that Al Franken began, and that's another thing altogether. And it stirred up some controversy. So I've been asking people what they think about you, and I've been taking notes. In IREB, we sensed a real desire on the part of our members and many in the Democratic Party to get to know you better and to ask the hard questions that I've heard around many a restaurant table since I started asking people what they thought of Richard Painter. So tonight I'd like to pose some of those questions. I want to thank you again for being willing to come out and talk with us frankly. And did you want to say a few words before we get started?
I'd like to get started with the questions, but I want to have a primary campaign that focuses on the issues and a general election that focuses on the issues. Obviously, Donald Trump and Mike Pence, both of them, are a serious issue. I think they are violating the Constitution, engaged in other illegal conduct, and that the United States Senate and House of Representatives need to convene hearings immediately, as they did when I was 12 years old and Richard Nixon was in the White House. This is a lot worse than what we had to deal with then, and Congress is doing absolutely nothing. So whether you send me to the Senate or Senator Smith, whoever goes to the Senate, they need to do their job, which is to hold this president and the vice president and the rest of them accountable. We need a health care system that works. This doesn't work, what we have going on right now. President Trump has made it a lot worse. Every single American should be covered. I think the single-payer system makes the most sense, and I'm happy to explain that, why that works economically, and particularly would be helpful for small business owners and entrepreneurs to have a single-payer system. Happy to hear ideas that everyone here has about that. Protection of the environment, absolutely critical, that we focus on climate change, and this should not be a partisan issue. President Theodore Roosevelt was one of the first people to speak out vigorously for environmental protection, and he was a Republican. President Nixon, despite all of his failings, did support the founding of the Environmental Protection Agency, now run by Scott Pruitt, who is a complete joke. Happy to talk about that. And copper nickel mining should not be happening near the waterways in Minnesota. And I will explain exactly why that should be. And I don't care whether you send me to the Senate or not, quite frankly. I got a great job at the University of Minnesota. But I don't care what happens. I'm going to make doggone sure that mine doesn't open. Another one of them. Twin Cities, North Parliament, it is a fraud. It is an embarrassment to the Democratic Farmer Labor Party that you tolerate politicians who support either of those mines. Anybody running for governor, United States Senator, or anywhere else. And I don't care whether I win or lose this election, those mines won't open in this state if I have anything to do with it. And I'll have to talk to you about that. Questions?
All right, so let's start with the obvious. You were a Republican as of last December.
Yes.
So there's a tweet, and I'm sure it's going to come up a lot in the primary. It says, I'm going to read it out loud. I am still a Republican because after they are all voted out of office, most of them should be, somebody needs to help rebuild. 2018 will be a GOP bloodbath, but our democracy requires two parties. We also need more energy in the center where most Americans are, but the GOP is not. So first thing I'd like to ask is when and why did you decide to leave the Republican Party? Why not run as a Republican or an independent?
The Republican Party will not tolerate dissent. And there are two problems with the Republican Party. One is over several decades, the party has moved steadily to the right. So someone like Arne Carlson, who supports my campaign, is persona non grata in the Republican Party because he will not support right-wing nuts for office. And that's where the Republican Party has moved over several decades. But without Donald Trump in office, without the authoritarian model of Donald Trump, we at least had, in my view, a Republican Party that was willing to function in a democracy, maybe at the far right wing of the democracy, with plenty of Citizens United money, but I never imagined we'd have Vladimir Putin in on the act. But with Donald Trump, it has gone over the edge. And the question is, how long was I going to stand there and continue to fight for a moderate to liberal wing of the Republican Party? I'm getting older. There's only so much time I've got for this fight, and it's not working. And if I were to try to run in a Republican primary for this Senate seat, I can guarantee you the White House would have poured in an enormous amount of money, because they would have rather had a Democrat in that seat than have me in there as a Republican, I guarantee you. And I'm going to make their life plenty miserable as a Democrat as well. So it's just not working with the Republican Party. Now, I got to say, we do need a two-party system that works. We need two parties that are willing to participate in a democracy for this to work long-term. But that's not what we're getting right now. It is very clear, if you do not swear allegiance to Donald Trump, you're out. Senator Corker and Senator Flake, a lot more conservative than I am on the issues, a lot of votes I very, very strongly disagree with. And yet, because they will not be loyal to Donald Trump, they were threatened with primary challenge so that they could not continue in the Senate. This is a move toward authoritarian rule. It's a threat toward democracy. So it's not just about the ideology of the parties, conservative versus liberal. It's about a threat to our democracy, and that's what we have with Donald Trump. I've had enough.
So why not run as an independent? Did you consider running as an independent?
I did. Look at my positions on the issues. Look at Senator Smith's positions on the issues. There are issues we strongly disagree on. For example, copper-nickel mining. I've taken a position on single-payer health insurance. We'll see what Senator Smith's position is. But there are going to be a lot of issues we agree on. And we know how that would work when we don't have ranked choice voting in this state. And that would have put Karen Housley in the United States Senate, and that would have been one more vote for Donald Trump. And once again, this is a threat to our democracy, what's going on right now. I'm not willing to do that. I'm just not willing to take that risk.
So one of the things that I've heard people say to me is if you switch parties once, you can switch parties again. So the question I want to ask is, what would it take for you to become a Republican again, and would you ever do that if you were in the Senate, elected as a Democrat?
If the Republican Party were willing to be in favor of single-payer health insurance and protect the environment, and the Democrats wanted to support copper-nickel mining and destroying the environment, and if we had a flip, we've had flips in the past. If you compare an electoral map of Eisenhower versus Stevenson to the electoral map of Bush versus Gore, it's almost as if you switched the states. So would that happen? No. That's not going to happen. The Republican Party is not going to agree with the positions that I've taken on the issues, not in the foreseeable future. I don't see that happening. But I'm not going to focus on party. I'm focusing on issues. And I will tell you my positions on the issues, and you can see whether you agree with them or not. And yes, I've had my disagreements with the Democratic Farmer Labor Party establishment on the mining issue. I don't think they're serious about health care until they're willing to stand up to the medical device companies, even though there's a lot of money in medical device companies in this state. But my disagreements with the Republican Party are far greater, and I cannot imagine living long enough to be willing to go back into this Republican Party. It's not working.
Okay. So you mentioned medical devices. An NPR recently mentioned, and I might ruin the pronunciation on this, but Valeant Pharmaceuticals. They came under SEC scrutiny in 2015 for drug price increases. When were you involved with them, and what was your role?
Yeah, I was an expert witness. I have a range of expert witness engagements where I'm called in to give my opinion on the a particular area of the law. And here is whether they could be sued in the United States for securities fraud in connection with that. Not on the merits, but whether if the complaint was true, there would be a cause of action in the United States. My opinion on that is answer yes. The reason I was retained by Valeant Pharmaceuticals is that they had another lawsuit pending in Canada, and the Canadian court wanted to know whether these same shareholders would have a cause of action inside the United States. And the answer was yes, they would. The role of an expert witness is to provide the opinion the expert witness has on the case. And in this case, it's the opinion that helped Valeant Pharmaceuticals in Canada in their litigation up there. That was my opinion. They got sued in the United States. I've had a lot of those expert witness engagements over the years. That's what a lot of law professors do. Elizabeth Warren, when she ran for the Senate, they got up all her expert witness engagements, and the Republicans tried to make a lot of hay out of it and got nowhere. I'm happy to discuss those to the extent it's publicly available information. That one is publicly available. But those are expert witness engagements. That doesn't mean I agree with everything the company does. That's not the point. It's what is your opinion on this specific legal issue, and once again, whether they could be sued in the United States. If the claims were true, the answer was yes. That's what we told the Canadian court.
Okay. One of the biggest positions and one of the most striking differences between Republicans and Democrats is choice and abortion access. What's your position on abortion access, and how long have you held that position?
Well, it's none of the government's business. This is not. So, that used to be the position, by the way, of the Republican Party before Reagan figured out a way to get to solidify Nixon had brought the South into the Republican Party, and this was a way to hold on to the so-called evangelical vote. Take it away from Jimmy Carter, who's the only real evangelical we had in the White House, but whatever. And then to try and get the right wing of the Catholic, the people who felt very strongly in abortion, and really put that ahead of everything else. That was a political ploy by the Reagan team. It fundamentally changed the Republican Party, created the gender gap in the Republican Party. I just don't think it's any of the government's business. And this is an issue where a lot of people are driven by their own personal moral values, their faith. I, for decades, have been a member of a church that is in favor of choice on abortion. I understand that other people have a different position. But once again, why should government get into it? We've got enough things for government to worry about rather than telling women what the decisions they ought to make about their own bodies when they're, when they're pregnant. Same thing with the end of life, by the way. Why is government regulating that? Or who you marry? And it's amazing to see the part of small government getting in all this stuff and telling everybody what to do. But that's where I am. Well, one more reason I'm persona non grata in the Republican Party. I came into this state, and I just moved here 2 or 3 years, and I told them, marriage amendment, you guys are nuts. Tell people who to marry. That's not what you're elected to do. Well, they wanted to go ahead and play that game, and they lost.
And have you always held that position, or how long have you?
That is not a government's business. Now, I would have to say that if you went back into the 1990s and you asked people, well, gee, should marriage be between a man and a woman or two people of the same sex? And, we remember Hillary Clinton, President Obama, when he was campaigning, people had different views on what marriage ought to be. I think we've been educated over the course of time. Many of us had changed our views of what marriage ought to be, what the definition of marriage ought to be. I certainly have as well. But the idea of once you have a society where there are very different views on something like that, and for government to take sides based on theology, which is what was going on there, is just categorically wrong. And so, yes, there was a time where we as a society moved toward wanting to accept same-sex marriages. in the late 90s, early 2000s, and I certainly agree with that.
And how about with regards to abortion access? Is that the position you've always held?
Yeah, I worked with people. The judge I clerked for was very strongly opposed. I know people brought this up to abortion. He was nominated in the Ninth Circuit for that reason by President Reagan. And of course he turned around and ruled against the government in a lot of death penalty cases, and all the conservatives got crazy. I've worked with people who are, with very strong convictions on the abortion issue, and I understand the other side of that debate, and I don't want to dismiss it. But at the end of the day, once again, when there are serious disagreements on something like that, should government take sides? And I have never endorsed the position that government should step in and take sides on that. That's your decision, whether to have an abortion or not. If you're a woman who is pregnant, it's your decision.
So as an ethics lawyer, we're going to move on, talk about your time as an ethics lawyer for the Bush administration. So as an ethics lawyer for the Bush administration, what did you do to try to put a stop to the frequent unethical behavior we saw from that administration?
I tried to deal with the issues that they had asked me to deal with as a lawyer for on financial conflicts of interest. I cannot, as the ethics lawyer for the Bush administration, tell them what to do in Iraq. And we could argue about whether what they did in Iraq was moral or immoral, or whether the war that was started 2 years before I went into the Bush administration as the ethics lawyer was moral or immoral, and whether they should have gotten out more quickly, or the torture memos at the Department of Justice, which I have condemned in writings that I published in 2010 in a book with Oxford University Press called Getting the Government America Deserves, and I discussed those torture memos and how despicable that is, but that is not something they're going to come to the ethics lawyer to address. The ethics lawyer's job is to focus on financial conflicts of interest for incoming administration officials. So, for example, Hank Paulson, Treasury Secretary nominee. He is a chief executive officer at Goldman Sachs. He comes into my office, considering the job, say, well, Mr. Paulson, what do you own? You obviously own a lot of Goldman Sachs stock. Yeah. How much? $600 million worth. I felt really sad for him. And you gotta sell it. That was my job. You gotta sell it. And here's what your ethics agreement's gonna look like with respect to dealings with Goldman Sachs. I had no input into who the Treasury Secretary is. That's not the role of the ethics lawyer. The ethics job in any administration, other than the Trump administration, is apolitical. Now, you usually have to be a registered member of the president's political party, which I was at the time, in order to get the job. But it is supposed to be apolitical. Whether you sell the Goldman Sachs stock, the answer to that shouldn't be any different in the Bush administration than in the Clinton administration, where they also had a Treasury Secretary who came out of Goldman Sachs. Now, do I have the ability to say, well, Mr. President, I don't think we should have a second Treasury Secretary out of Goldman Sachs? Maybe somebody else should be Treasury Secretary? No, I can't do that. Do we need to change the system? Wall Street goes to Washington? Yes. That's my job as a professor. I wrote a book about that. But I can't deal with that as the ethics lawyer. Is okay, this is what the law is. And that's what I can do. So it's mostly financial conflicts of interest for nominees. Some of the issues have to do with gifts that were given to people in the White House. Believe it or not, the Saudi government wanted to give the National Security Advisor a Rolex watch. Yeah, that doesn't work under the Emoluments Clause of the Constitution. Well, it works in this administration because they ignore the Emoluments Clause of the Constitution. But that was my job, is to deal with the financial conflicts of interest, tell them what the law is. I am very glad that President Obama in January 2009 tightened up on the revolving door in and out of government with an executive order, because that executive order made the law say the same thing that I had been telling the Bush administration in several instances was the right thing to do, even if it wasn't the legally required thing to do. And I won some of those battles and I lost others. And President Obama certainly upped the ante on that, and that's why nobody ever heard of me over 8 years, a government ethics lawyer, because generally things were pretty good. Then Trump came along.
So as an ethics lawyer for the Bush administration, what was your role in the confirmation of Alito and Roberts to the Supreme Court, and what is your opinion on their rulings today?
Well, they certainly didn't come to me and say, do you ideologically agree with these judges, and read their opinions and tell me what you think of their opinions. What they did is they gave me the names, very confidentially, of a number of people they were considering for these positions and their financial disclosure forms. And my job was to supervise people who would look at all these companies they own stock and find out all the subsidiaries of those companies. And someone else did a search of all the cases they decided and see if you get some hits. And believe it or not, you do. If you get a case where a judge has decided a case where that judge owns stock in the company, that is a violation of judicial ethics rules. And you can bet the Senate's going to figure that out. And that's going to come in confirmation. You do not want to nominate that judge. I described this process in my 2009 book. And so that was my job. And then once they were selected, I'd sit down with them and talk to them about financial conflicts of interest and those issues. Yes, people want to imagine that I had the power to decide whether President Bush should nominate Justice Alito or Chief Justice Roberts. Sorry, I didn't have that much power. I do happen to know that there were some moderates under consideration. I can't reveal who their names were, but I have opined, and I think I am correct, that if President Bush had had to deal with Democrats controlling the Senate, he might very well have nominated someone like Merrick Garland. And that's what I said in the New York Times. And everybody in the Bush White House who had been there with me immediately jumped on me and said Painter had absolutely no role in the decision making. And that's true. But I watched them making decisions, and I knew what they would have probably done if they'd had to deal with the Democratic Senate. As for Justice Alito and Roberts, Justice Alito has been predictable. I disagree with most of his decisions. Chief Justice Roberts, I disagree with a lot of his decisions. I think he did the right thing on the Affordable Health Care Act. So there's some decisions where he has been willing to show some leadership in this court. Justice Alito has been more or less predictable, I would say. And I would not agree with a lot of the decisions. We can go through specific decisions, but I would not agree with a lot of them.
So well, let's talk about a specific decision. So one of them may have heard of as Citizens United. What's your opinion on Citizens United? And Alito and Roberts were both in the majority on that decision. Did that surprise or trouble you?
Yeah, it troubled me a lot. A lot out there on the internet about me and Citizens United. It's the worst decision this court's ever handed down. It's terrible. We talk about judicial activism. You sit around, you listen to people complain about judicial activism, and yet, what do we have going on there? We have 9 justices. I don't think any of them have held elective office, and 5 of them are convinced that they know better than the United States Congress in one of those very few instances where the United States Congress actually chooses to regulate campaign finance and to say that it's unconstitutional because a corporation has a First Amendment right to influence politicians. Now, anybody who's been in elected office knows exactly what goes on when that money comes in the door. And that, this idea the Supreme Court has, you have to prove a quid pro quo. We can never prove a quid pro quo unless somebody's really stupid and says, well, here's the money in return for that. I want to get indicted. We all know that. Anyone who's been in a campaign knows what goes on. That's why I will not accept any PAC money. I don't want to deal with those people, much less the super PACs and the dark money organizations. It's Citizens United, awful decision. What are we going to do about it? If I were in the Senate, I would insist on answers to questions from nominees. No more of this, well, I won't comment on a pending case. Well, come on. Citizens United was decided in 2009. The Supreme Court was getting into something that's none of its business. Barry Goldwater even said the Supreme Court shouldn't have been getting into campaign finance. And that corporate money shouldn't be in campaigns. This shows how crazy it is. It was John McCain's law that was struck down, McCain-Feingold. I want a nominee who's going to tell me under oath that they're going to vote to reverse that decision. The Supreme Court was wrong, And second, I don't want to hear any more of this. I won't comment on a penny case when asked about Roe v. Wade. That's 45 years old, for crying out loud. So, it's not just a question of what my opinion is. It's a question of whether I'm going to go in there in the Senate and say, I want a straight answer, or I'm just going to vote no. And no more of this dodging the question and then going in there and doing whatever you told the president of the White House you were going to do in order to get the job. I'm not going to play that game anymore.
And this one's really controversial today. Do you believe in science?
Real science, yeah. I mean, you could have science that, where Glencore Polymet, they got some scientists working for them and tell you that that's going to be a safe mine, right? Well, is this some Polymet water here? No, I don't think so. No, I want real science. And I don't know where we got into the idea that somehow science is bad. But we need real science, unbiased science, not science that's funded by somebody who has an agenda.
So speaking of science that's funded by an agenda, climate change. How big a danger do you believe is posed by climate change, and what do you think we should do about it?
Like everybody thinks that. Everybody who looks at the facts knows there's a huge problem with climate change, and it's because a lot of it because of carbon emissions. That shouldn't be a partisan issue. I don't know why it is. Obviously, people in the fossil fuel business have a different opinion on it, just like the people who want to build the mines in northern Minnesota have a different opinion because they got a dog in the hunt. They got money in it. But everyone else who has to live with the climate change, whose children are going to have to live with it, ought to face up the basic facts. If you actually read a newspaper instead of watch Fox News all the time, I mean, it's pretty clear what's going on. Okay, what are you going to do about it? That's the hard part. It's not whether it's a problem and whether it is a very serious problem. What are you going to do about it? And first of all, we ought to get back into the Paris Accords and talk with other countries, because this is a problem which we have to solve collectively on a global level. We can't have the United States doing one thing, China doing another. We've got to try to get everybody on the same plane here. Second, we need to think seriously about a carbon tax. Because a carbon tax, somebody told me you can't call it a tax anymore. When I was younger, you could actually call something a tax and people wouldn't get all worked up about it. But anyway, actually the way I learned economics when I was in college, they say, well, look, if there's a huge social externality, you tax it. That's what you do with carbon emissions. And then if there's a social benefit, a positive externality, you subsidize it. So you want to use the tax code to help companies get off the ground that are in solar energy or other clean renewable forms of energy, try and move toward automobiles that are electrically powered and then generate the electricity through clean energy. You want to supplement some of that with the tax revenues. I mean, that makes sense because there are social externalities, positive and negative, various forms of human activity. And I can't think of any that has a larger social externality than the carbon emissions. We don't deal with that soon. What's going to happen is every year we let pass, we're going to pay a lot higher price down the road. So that just means we're sloughing it off to our kids. But this shouldn't be a partisan issue.
So one of the other largest issues that's going on in the United States right now is healthcare. We have a healthcare crisis. What do you think is the best way to solve the healthcare crisis in this country?
Well, everybody's got to be insured. You got to have 100% of the people insured, because if you don't, what you're going to have people going to the emergency room. That's a lot more expensive. If people don't have insurance and they don't have a relationship with a primary care physician, you don't have the preventative care that you need to try to reduce the amount of incidents where you have much more serious health problems later on. It makes absolutely no sense to not have everybody be insured. We need 100% of the Americans assured. Okay, how are we going to deal with this? One route is to continue to expand the Affordable Care Act, include more and more people with plans that are provided by private insurers. And we can do that. It will cost us a whale of a lot of money. And the worst thing is to do what the Trump administration did, which is to repeal the individual mandate. Because that means that some people who game the system think they don't have health care bills this year, they don't pay. That just means I pay more. Watch your rates go sky high. And then Trump will, of course, blame it on Obama along with everything else. We could expand the Affordable Care Act and include everybody with all these individual private plans. But it's going to cost an enormous amount because we do not have a single payer insurer that has, first, the ability to cut the red tape, cut out all the profits that are being distributed to shareholders of insurance companies. This CEO has to get, his or her 10 or 15 million in order to have a happy life and all that. There's a lot of excess of profit right there in the insurance companies. And that's just the beginning of it. And here's where things get more sensitive, is does the insurance company negotiate reasonable prices from the drug companies, the providers, and the medical device companies? And the answer is no. Why do drugs cost more in the United States than they cost in Canada and Europe? Well, they got the single payer, we don't. So we pay more for the drug. The drug company comes back and says, well, that pays for the research. Well, at a certain point, do we as a society want to be paying for research and development in drugs to benefit the entire world when we don't have enough money to insure every single American, ensure that people are healthy here? And the answer I've got to that is no. And we need to have that ability to negotiate down the drug prices. And the drug companies then will go to the senators from their states, say we're in New Jersey, so I think Cory Booker finally told them he'll come out for single payer, but they will go to their senators in California, everywhere else, and say, we need to keep the high drug prices because we need more money for research and development. I say hogwash. And the same thing I say to medical device companies, and I know they have a lot of power in this state. The CEO of Medtronic did have a fundraiser for Senator Smith at his home. It was advertised. It was my campaign staff got it. I don't know why we got it. They've got a lot of power in this state. You do not cross Medtronic in this state if you want elected office. Well, sorry. Medtronic's a great company, but they have no right to charge Americans any more for those medical devices than they charge Canadians or Europeans. And if I'm in the United States Senate, that's my position. That's why we need single payer. And, that's where I am on it. I also believe that every single member of the House and Senate should divest of stocks in medical device companies, energy companies, defense contractors. It's just wrong. So, you choose to send Senator Smith into this election and support her in August, that's fine. Sell the stock. Amy Klobuchar has done it the right way. She has a portfolio with mutual funds and with life insurance. That is a conflict-free portfolio. That's what Amy Klobuchar has. That's exactly what I did with executive branch officials when I was in the Bush White House Ethics Office. And every single member of Congress should do the same, and you should insist on that from your members of Congress and your United States senators. And I can say this here to Senator Smith. I don't have a large microphone, but I go down on this. She goes in. She better sell the stock because Karen House is going to jump in there with $2 million worth of PAC money and say the same thing, super PAC money. Sell the stock and endorse single payer. And we wouldn't have to deal with this. And by the way, Medtronic will still have plenty of money and will be just fine, and the CEO will get to keep his house at Lake of the Isles, and he'll be just fine too.
So one of the things that has been kind of is not the right phrase, extremely eye-opening for me over the last couple years. Two things in particular. The night of the election, I discovered something that a lot of other people in this country already knew, which is exactly how deep-seated and how far the racism in this country runs. And the second thing I discovered over the next year or so is how many women were being abused and or sexually harassed vis-a-vis the Me Too movement and everything that came up around that. If you were a senator, what would you do to try and address that issue of the Me Too movement and sexual harassment?
Well, we need to focus not just on the high-profile cases which you hear about in the news, but what happens to a lot of working women who don't have choices. Because we say that there is an avenue of redress for the EEOC, and that you can file complaints and all that. Well, what do you do if you have to worry about your paycheck? And you may have to leave your job. You might not be fired in a retaliatory way because, they wouldn't do that, but it just make your life miserable. Or coworkers make your life miserable. I mean, do we have a system that works for ordinary people who are working in jobs where they have to keep that job to pay the rent, to feed their kids, and they're being sexually harassed? We need to fix the system. So women are being sexually harassed, and some men are being sexually harassed. I've talked to gay men who've been sexually harassed in employment in a range of different organizations, and who have no avenue of redress, particularly in the lower wage jobs, where you can't say, well, I am willing to take the risk of losing my paycheck to complain about this. We need to fix the system. Someone who's being harassed ought to be able to file a complaint without fear of retaliation. If they want to leave the job, be able to receive benefits or some payment. Maybe that comes out of an insurance fund or something where the employers pay into, so that someone who is harassed has the economic security to be able to say no to that employer. Because this isn't working for a lot of people. And that's not what we're focusing on. We focus on the high-profile cases, the victims of Harvey Weinstein, who can hire Alan Dershowitz as his lawyer. No get me going on Alan Dershowitz, but anyway. We're focusing on the high-profile cases and thinking that's going to solve the problem. You're not going to solve the problem until you have a complaint mechanism in place where victims of discrimination, whether it be sexual harassment, sexual assault, or other discrimination, homophobia, have an opportunity to file a complaint and not suffer economically for it. And we're not focusing on that. We need to fix the law.
How about with regards to racism, and particularly the thing that's troubled me the most? There's a lot of racism, but the thing that's troubled me the most is police brutality. It seems like we see another one that's live filmed every week, every couple weeks. And I feel like it's just falling on deaf ears.
Yeah.
What can we do about that? What would you do as a senator?
Well, let's start with what we can do and then try to figure out what the federal government does versus the state governments and the municipalities. One, you need a lot better training for police officers. Police officers are not receiving the training they need with respect to how to handle situations where the police officer feels threatened. And also with respect to racial bias and how a racial bias that you might have instinctively that you may not recognize, but in a situation where you feel threatened, surfaces and affects your judgment. So we need a lot better training of police officers. Second, a lot of police officers are irrational and are scared because of the amount of guns out there. We need to address the gun problem. You know, that is a huge issue. And we had a police officer who was killed in Mendota Heights, where I live, a number of years ago. Now, you know, the guy shot him, was a white guy with a car, you know, who pulled the guy over. The police officer goes up, gets shot and killed. But the fact of the matter is, when you combine the number of guns on the street and the police officers feel threatened with inherent racial biases that many people have, but most people are not in life or death situations where they feel threatened. That is a very, very bad situation. So one, better training. Second, deal with our gun problem. We've got to deal with our gun problem. And third, we do need to be serious about bringing in more African Americans, more minorities group members into the police forces. If there's any area where affirmative action and other efforts to recruit a diverse police force, if there's any area where we need more affirmative action as in law enforcement, I think we can use a number of different strategies to address this. So, you know, the federal government should get involved, certainly in investigating. The Justice Department should be investigating civil rights violations, as they were on a number of these under the Obama administration. I don't know what they're investigating under Trump, but they should be doing that. Congress should address this with extra funding for training of police officers, and should strongly encourage a much more diverse police force than we have in a lot of places in the United States. So there's a lot we can do on this. But one, we got to recognize it's a serious problem. Recognize that police officers are in a very challenging situation. They feel threatened too, largely because of our gun situation. But also address inherent racial bias that can come into any job And in policing, that can be extremely dangerous.
I asked my kids, I have a 9-year-old and a 12-year-old, and I told them I'm going to be interviewing a Senate candidate tonight, which I've never done before, and did they have any questions did they have a question they wanted me to ask? And I got one that was kind of open-ended, but I thought it was really good. My 12-year-old wants to know, what are you going to do as a senator?
Well, this is a 2-year term, so if I were to win this election, I want to accomplish a lot in 2 years, because I like my job at the University of Minnesota. I don't want to go to Washington and just sit around and do nothing. One, I want to get rid of Donald Trump and Mike Pence. But, you got to have some other senators who want to do that, and some other members of the House of Representatives. We need to convene those hearings. So I wouldn't want to be on the Senate Judiciary Committee, we need to have those hearings. And we need to investigate everything that's going on, because Bob Mueller is just responsible for the Russia investigation and only criminal activity in connection with the Russia investigation. Well, there's a lot of stuff that's going on that's unconstitutional, it's not criminal, and there's a lot of criminal activity that involves things other than Russia. Well, that's the job of the House and Senate Judiciary Committee, so it's time to get to work. That's one priority. Single-payer health care, absolutely critical. Senator Sanders has a good bill. We'll just make sure that people willing to bite the bullet on the cost of the bill and impose the necessary taxes to pay for it. And we have to look at the numbers. I think it'd be reasonable to say that everybody pays 10% of their income for health insurance. If you make, if you're below the poverty line, I mean, we shouldn't obviously require that. But if somebody's making middle-class income or whatever, something reasonable or more, 10% of your income. You make $50,000, you pay $5,000. You make $500,000, you pay $50,000. And yes, if you make $100 million, cup up to $10 million. Big deal. Sorry, Donald Trump, but I've never been in his shoes, so I don't feel bad for him. But anyway, the point is that we need to pay for it, and it requires raising the taxes or the premium or the fee, whatever we call it. We got to be willing to say that. Get voted out of office, get voted out of office. So I want to do that. And then third, I want to deal with the environmental situation, particularly with climate change. And the copper nickel mining thing is easy in the United States Senate. Just say no to that this land swap. I mean, that's ridiculous. I mean, they got federal land here, and their environmental laws apply to the federal land. And so Polymet, which is really Glencore, run by a bunch of Europeans and Russians or whatever, they buy the land over here, and they persuade the United States Congress to do a land swap so they don't have to obey the environmental laws in the federal land. I mean, just say vote no on that thing. And that's not going to take any time to say no.
With regard to Russia, we're seeing propaganda like we've never seen in this country, through social media especially, but also through national news outlets. I could do a little cough and be coy, but I think we can say Fox News here. What can we do from a congressional standpoint to stem that or combat that?
It's a challenge. First of all, recognize it's a problem. And believe it, there are people in this country who do not think that Russia influenced the election. Yeah. Same people who believe that President Obama wasn't born in the United States or there's some deep state. I mean, it's just amazing the complete BS that people buy. So we got to recognize it's a problem, and I think that people do, on the whole, unless they're watching Fox News all the time. But it's a serious problem. Now, how do you deal with it? That's a lot more difficult. You do not want to interfere with the First Amendment right of individuals to express their opinions. But if Facebook has an account and they entice you to use Facebook, and you are told that you are interfacing with people who are who they say they are, and you're talking to an unemployed steel worker in Pittsburgh who says that everything that happened to them in their life was a fault of Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, or Barack Obama, never mind the Bushes, and that Donald Trump is their Lord and Savior, at least that person ought to be an unemployed worker in Pittsburgh, not some 20-year-old in the outskirts of Moscow. And Facebook ought to be responsible for either telling you that we have no scrutiny whatsoever, and it's a complete joke, in which case it's theater, or that we are actually, screening these people. Facebook ought to be honest with you as to who you're dealing with, at a bare minimum. I think we can require that. Second, though, we are way behind in terms of how do we use the internet to advance democracy. Because we can't. Vladimir Putin is using the internet to destroy our democracy. How could we use it to advance democracy? What I have asked is that the state legislatures set aside one night, each night, Monday night, a debate. First Congressional District, primary candidates. Tuesday night, Second Congressional District, candidates. Wednesday night, the Third Congressional District. Open up a room in the state legislature. Film that debate. Put that on the internet, on YouTube. How much would that cost? Very little. We can use technology and the internet to make our democracy better by simply expecting that candidates would show up for debates, including Senator Smith, who I've asked to debate me. I have not yet received a response. And have a debate, put it on the internet, and people watch the debate. We could use the internet and technology to fight back against Citizens United. What do we have now? Something different. Candidates refuse to debate, and yet they get their ads from the super PACs and the PACs and the dark money organizations. Super PACs and PACs, at least we think we know who gives them the money. The dark money organizations, it could be Vladimir Putin for all we know. And that's how we think we're going to win elections. So we, the American people, we're partially responsible. We can't just blame it on Russia. If we don't insist our candidates have debates, put them on the internet, use the technology to our advantage. And it's a great advantage. When I was a kid, if there was a debate, you know, you'd have to watch it on television. You have to get the TV station to bother to cover the debate. And then you have to watch it the night it was on. And then when I was a little older, they invented the VCR. Maybe you could tape the debate. It wouldn't work. But we have we can use technology to make our democracy better. But we have to have the will to do it and insist that the candidates play along and participate in the debate, in the discussion. And then tell Vladimir Putin to pound sand.
One issue that Al Franken was very outspoken on, which was refreshing to me because it's been an issue of mine for a long time, is mandatory arbitration clauses in employment agreements or cell phone agreements or just about anywhere you go, you run into them today. Do you have a position on mandatory arbitration agreements? Would you pursue action against them in Congress?
Mandatory arbitration agreement between a corporation and a consumer or an employee? No, I mean they shouldn't have. I mean obviously there's an imbalance of power there. If with the agreements that ought to be enforceable, if you have one large company endorses an arbitration agreement with a second large company over some transaction, well that's all right. Two big companies want to agree to arbitrate a dispute they have and say spending millions of dollars on lawyers, that's fine. But a corporation has an arbitration agreement with a customer or with an employee, well that's just, it's called a contract of adhesion. They say, okay, here's the contract, if you want to be an employee, you got to sign it. If you want to be a customer, you got to sign it. I mean, that's not a fair bargain. And I've dealt with these in the securities area. I've done a lot of work in securities litigation where the broker-dealer says, okay, you want to be a customer, you sign the arbitration agreement. Or my brother's been a broker-dealer in New York for a number of decades, and he had employers say, oh, you got to sign the arbitration agreement. So if you get in a dispute with your employer, you got to go in front of an arbitration panel. And guess who the arbitration panel is stacked in favor of? I mean, of course it's a scam. They shouldn't allow it, but Congress needs to pass a law.
And we talked a little bit about gun control before. What gun control measures would you propose or support?
I think you ought to have registration of guns. And you ought to have a record of who has bought what guns after a background check. Something analogous to what we do with automobiles. Now, obviously, it's a different set of problems with guns as with automobiles. But it's amazing that nobody feels threatened that the state of Minnesota knows how many automobiles are in their garage, and that you have to have a license to operate one. And they, and they can take away the license if you got a problem. We have a lot of rules there, and people don't feel threatened by it. You can't hot rod as much as you could maybe in the 1950s or something, and we have stricter rules on drinking and so forth for public safety. but we don't feel as if our right to drive is somehow interfered with, our right to enjoy our car. And yet it's this obsession with guns that somehow you're anti-gun if you think there ought to be some rules. It makes absolutely no sense, the attitude we've got with the NRA. I was a guy out in the bar wearing the NRA hat. I had to keep my mouth shut, but it's just ridiculous. Yeah, well, we had the American Automobile Association was founded, I think, about the same time as the National Rifle Association. The American Automobile Association had that same attitude and control of Congress. Imagine it would be like driving the Crosstown Expressway. You'd be picking up the dead bodies of the beer cans every morning. We've got to have rules. We've got to have rules here. Do we ban AR-15s? This is the problem you get into. If you're going to try and get people to turn in their guns, I don't think it's going to be happening. Ban additional sales or have a very high threshold for purchasing assault weapons. Definitely. We need to move toward a society where those high-powered weapons are only in the hands of law enforcement, in people who are connected with law enforcement, or the so-called well-regulated militia that the founders described in the Second Amendment. So we've got to have some rules, folks.
What about like a buyback program?
All for it. I think we could buy back guns. I don't know if a lot of these people got the guns, don't necessarily want to sell them. But
yeah.
All for that. And, I heard enough of this. I keep getting, every time I say something about the NRA, I got about 10 emails coming to my university email address saying, come and get it.
So I did want to save a little time for opening to questions from the floor. If anybody has anything. Karen, yeah.
I'm just curious where you stand with immigration policy. That seems to be really a hot topic right now since families are being separated at the border.
So I'm just going to repeat that for anybody in the back. It's a question about immigration policy, given the suffering of people at the border and everything else that we're seeing today.
Well, it's a mess right now. First of all, you can deal with people already here. And, well, I think basically if people have been here 5 years or longer, just get them citizenship. And, I know you got to take a test. They say you got to take a test for citizenship, I guess, but, they have a test that I don't think half the White House staff could pass. But whatever. So I would skip the test and all that stuff. I mean, the point is that people have been here 5 years or longer, just get the citizenship and get them going. So they're paying taxes like everybody else. We don't have this sort of underground economy going on. And say people have been here illegally when Americans have been employing them for that long is ridiculous. They're here legally. They came here maybe illegally. They've been here employed, and people have been employing them. Just people have been here 5 years. I think that'd be a reasonable cutoff point. We can discuss where that would be. With respect to trying to limit illegal immigration going forward, hold the employers accountable for hiring undocumented workers. That's where the problem is, not with people coming here and taking the jobs that the employers are willing to give. So focus on the employers and requiring people to have the documentation, to get the documentation for their employees. The policies, obviously, the way they're handling if people entering this country illegally is atrocious. Separating children from their parents, the cruelty of the system. It was bad before. It was bad. It's been bad for 20 years. Judge John Noonan, the judge I was speaking about, who's my co-author on the legal ethics case book, he had written several articles and he handed down several opinions about the atrocious system they had in place in Arizona about 10 or 15 years ago. So it's been bad, but President Trump's made it absolutely awful. Of course, the DACA program makes sense. But as I say, I think people have been here more than 5 years. They're part of our economy. They're our fellow Americans. Come on, the people came over on the Mayflower didn't get permission to come over either. So, whatever.
Over there.
I haven't heard you address anything yet about the economy. And one of the things that when I think about the differences between Republicans and Democrats, and I'm wondering if this might have been your case is that Republicans tend to, from what I can tell, be more on the side of corporations than the citizens. And so my question for you is, we're looking at a growing divide, especially with the tax bill, so I want to ask you about the tax bill. But what I want to ask you is, really, what is your stance economically? How are we going to address that growing divide between the super rich and the people who have nothing?
Yeah. Well, this has some historical perspective. As I understand, the top tax bracket under President Eisenhower, Republican, was 70 or 80%, depending on the year, for the very top tax bracket. For the people like Donald Trump, if he makes as much money as he says he makes, that is. You know, we have steadily cut the top brackets. So, of course, you're going to get growing income disparity, inequality, when you do that. You know, the major change was under President Reagan. So, you know, I do think we need to recognize the fact we have an enormous deficit. Republicans traditionally wanted to focus on balancing the budget, but the last time they did was under President Eisenhower. There's been a lot of talk about that. I think that what we need to do is think about, you know, who ought to be responsible for, you know, the public expenditures and taxes. And, you know, we have a lot of wealth at the very, very top, and that's been a trend over the past 20 or 30 years. So we need to face up to that. And it's not I'm against rich people. And I don't think it ought to be us versus them. But it's a question of, are you paying your fair share? And we need a tax code that requires people to pay their fair share. And at a certain point, the amount of money you're making may or may not be related to how much hard work you've been doing. Maybe it's related to luck, or whether, you know, you happen to make a good investment and other people working for you. And so, you know, we should expect people who have a lot to give a little bit more back. And that doesn't mean I'm against them. It shouldn't be, as to say, us versus them. We need a fairer tax code. And that ought to be a priority. And then there are other areas where you know, I don't want to get into a situation where corporations are evil or bad. We've had good corporations, good banks, well-run banks. We've also had some banks that are terribly run. And that's what caused the 2008 financial crisis. So without demonizing bankers, which I think is the wrong approach, I think we need to get people to play by the rules. And that's what went wrong in 2008. I wrote a book about that. It was published in 2015 with my colleague at the law school, Claire Hill, called Better Bankers, Better Banks. You can go through that. And we propose that, you know, these people run these banks and pay themselves a lot of money when times are good. And then the bank gets hit with a fine, or they get in trouble with the SEC. What we said is take that out of their pay. And don't require some showing that the CEO was at fault. Come on, I mean, he or she looked the other way. We know it. Just take it out of their pay. If they're going to make a lot of money when the bank does well, when they get in trouble, they should pay for it. So, you know, I'm not against bankers. I'm not anti-business. But I want to see business conducted in a responsible, in a socially responsible manner. And that's the way a capitalist economy works. So if you really believe in free enterprise and in capitalism, that's what you buy into. Not this free-for-all where people do whatever they want and then run away from responsibility and leave everyone else holding the bag.
Would you support a transaction tax?
On the securities transactions?
Overall. So there's two economists, one from Princeton, one from Yale. How they got together, who knows? It's not a joke.
Yep.
They came up with a model, and it was published in the early 80s, and that model still holds true today. And the model is simply this, is that 1/10 of 1% of every transaction, for every dollar involved in the transaction, is taxed at 1/10 of 1%. Doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, corporate America, French, doesn't matter. Any transaction that takes place dealing with a company or individual in the U.S., doesn't matter from where, 1/10 of 1%. If we had that, we could fund our own health care, one-payer system. We could fund states at a higher level, education at a higher level, municipalities at a higher level, and pay down our debt 5 years.
Happy to look at it. I've endorsed a transaction tax in one area, which is the securities trades, all these hedge funds They're whipping in and out of stuff all the time
Those would
and
be included.
manipulating the market. I might have a little higher tax there. I maybe have an old-fashioned idea of investing that you buy and you hold, or at least for a couple of months, as opposed to the whipping in and out of it in this business. So I've supported transaction taxes there. I'd be very happy to look at that type of proposal. This is the only thing. I don't want to go on the floor of the Senate and be pushing something that I'm not getting anywhere, but I'd be happy to look at it and see if we could have a broader, approach. It was a transaction tax or something else. It could raise the revenue. But I don't want to be spending a lot of time on something that is going to work well in the faculty lounge, but I can't get through the Senate. So I got to balance those. But I would be, I've not heard of that particular study.
About 80% of what you talked about, 83% is going to get to this Senate.
Well, that may not be either. I'm going to try my hardest, but I will look at it. I would look at it, absolutely. But I just say the one area I have looked at it is securities transactions, and I'm for it because I think these speculators are destroying the market. All the hedge fund people.
Right in the middle here.
Hi, I'm Natalie. So our lovely slime ball of I struggle to call my representative because he's not.
Which district are you in?
District 2.
That's my district. Oh, yeah.
So, I was at a town hall with his. I did get a ticket. And you're welcome, everybody. And I wanted to know, he refuses to meet with people of color. So I want to know, how are you going to address issues that affect people who look like me, people who don't? Because one of my frustrations, when I was interning in the Senate in college, one of my frustrations was that even the people who worked in the office, in Al Franken, I did work in his office, was more diverse than other offices. But my question to you is, how do you plan to surround yourself with people who are of diverse backgrounds, not just of race, but of economic backgrounds? Because I think that is so important to your decision making as a senator, knowing that you can't know everything about everything, but your team has this unique ability to give you this perspective. And how are you going to make sure that you have perspectives from students like myself, graduates like myself, who have student loans, who have different problems? Like, I would love to be a white man, not gonna lie, like, what would it be like to not see people get stopped or the police called for the simple fact of existing? So how are you going to surround yourself with people who can say, hey, racial profiling, that person following you around the mall, yeah, that happens. What can you do to do it? Like,
Well, you have to have a more diverse staff and bring people in, and you bring interns and represent diverse backgrounds, so you can listen. But then also go into the state and talk to people from diverse backgrounds about what's happening to them. And this is a problem not just about Jason Lewis is obviously an issue, okay? But let's talk about whether if you elect a Democratic senator or congressperson or governor, what are they doing to serve everybody? And here's an example. A lot of the government subsidized housing in Minnesota is highly segregated. My colleague, Myron Orfeld at the University of Minnesota, has written several studies on that are posted on the University of Minnesota website. And what happens is that the powers that be in both political parties get in with the developers who build these projects, make a ton of money, and nobody is prioritizing whether the housing projects that are subsidized are integrated. Is this good for our children? Shouldn't that be a priority when government money is used? And I am in favor of using government money for housing subsidies. But when they don't even bother to focus on something so fundamental as to whether you have an integrated housing program. And the state government isn't focusing on that, and the federal government isn't. And oh, by the way, who is investing in HUD housing? Sean Hannity.
Yeah.
Think he cares about HUD housing? No. So here's just one example of government programs that many Democrats would support. But if they are not administered in a responsible manner in the public interest, with people getting input from people in minority communities about how is this actually working for us or not working, Are you using the government program to further segregation or to actually integrate communities? People aren't asking those hard questions. And they're not. Why? Because you don't have as many people from African American communities and other minority communities in powerful positions in the state government who are making those decisions in Minnesota, and the same in the United States Congress, and the same in HUD, even under President Obama. And it's just gotten much worse, obviously, under President Trump. So the Jason Lewises of this world and the Trumps, I mean, those are the easy cases where they wear the bigotry right on their face. But if we want to address these problems, we need to listen to people in the communities that are affected by government decisions.
So I'd like to just kind of follow up on that quick, because the question was, I think you addressed the question, but also specifically with regards to your office and your staff, do you have individuals in mind that of people of color that you would have on your staff, or if not, would you reach out?
It'd be absolutely critical as a United
like,
States Senator.
part of that reasoning is because I noticed that people who work on Capitol Hill were largely white. And not that I have a problem with white people.
Yeah.
I am half white. But my problem lies in the fact that if you've never been racially profiled, if you've never feared the police like I do, I seriously have a fear of the police. Like, I see them and I freeze. And I don't know how to describe that to somebody other than to say, like, it's really hard for me to feel safe in this world. But if you don't have people who are on your team who say another person was killed by a police officer, where you talked about that, like, we need more racial profiling, but I also think we need that at our federal level. And I want you to, like, I would like your team to reflect that community in Minnesota that has been largely ignored, not just by Republicans, but as I read the history of Minnesota, it's been largely white. And people who look like me are ignored in this history. And it's really upsetting because I'm like, I'm a Minnesotan too, I'm just not, I don't ice fish.
Well, yes. I don't like ice fish either. I'll tell you, this is the problem. Our state is becoming increasingly diverse in its population, but the power structures in both political parties are not. And that shows. And that shows in the policies that are being pursued and whether or not people are listening to people in communities of color and others who are affected by government decisions. Yes, a United States Senator absolutely should have a diverse staff. That's absolutely critical. But you need a diverse staff back in the state government as well. And you need people who are reaching out to the communities that are affected by these decisions. And who is asking people in the affected community what kind of housing projects make sense? Or what kind of school, when they have these charter school programs, what's happening? Is it that someone wants to start a charter school and they want to make a lot of money and they're schmoozing the politicians? Or is this something from the ground up? I think it's the former in far too many cases. And so what you have is people who are part of the power structure who still are, in this state, particularly given our history, going to be predominantly white, who are making these decisions. Now, I'm going to try as best I can to address these issues. And having a diverse staff is going to be part of it. But we need others in the government of Minnesota to be working with me and with others who are determined to address these problems. And we certainly don't need Jason Lewis.
So we'll go, I see a few that have been up for a while. Did you still have one? So we'll go here, we'll go there, we'll go there.
Okay. Hi. My name is Dee. I'm also from SD51. I live in Egan. And my question has to do with the endorsement process. I've heard from a number of Democrats, and I've seen on Facebook pages that them saying that you're going to abide by the endorsement process. But what I've seen on your Twitter account from April 12th, you said, abide by the endorsement is a promise you won't run in a primary if the party hacks and money men endorse someone else at the convention.
Absolutely right. And I don't know who said I was.
Let me finish.
Yep.
And so my comment is that people endorsing at the convention are not money men or party hacks. They're people like this in this room. And so if you don't intend to abide by the endorsement process, why haven't you been explicitly clear about that so that there was no confusion among Democrats? And the other thing is, why are you even bothering with running for the endorsement process if you don't, if you think it's so bad?
I made it very clear that I will abide by the endorsement of the people of the state of Minnesota. These two parties need to be run by the people. And you are not going to win an election in November when you say that the people meet at a convention who have been working, yes, in the DFL, and the Republicans will do the same thing in their endorsement, will endorse somebody, and nobody is expected to run in primaries. It is wrong. The parties should be owned by the people. And that is how you're going to win in November. And the same thing with the gubernatorial race. I made it very clear. I think there ought to be a contested race in August. Or you're going to lose, because the Republicans are going to have a contested race. And I don't know which of these two, I don't know which is worse, they're going to choose. But they're going to have a contested race.
But
And it's
I
just
think
categorically wrong.
You're conflating the endorsement process and the primary process.
Exactly. The primary is where the decision ought to be made by the people. There's nothing wrong. Absolutely. The people own the parties. The people own the system. And so I will seek the endorsement of any individual or group of individuals that wants to endorse me, including in the convention in Rochester. I will never abide by an endorsement of any political party. I don't think it is right. I think it's wrong to ask people to abide by the endorsement. It looks like it's being fixed, and the people will categorically reject that. And that's my position, and I feel the same way about the Republican Party. Governor Dayton did the exact right thing. And I don't appreciate the fact that he could only do it because he had a lot of money, and that someone else is expected not to do it, but he did the exact right thing that everybody should be able to do. Take your case to the people.
But he didn't seek the DFL endorsement.
Yeah.
He bypassed that and went right to the primary
Absolutely.
because he said what you're saying. So I think you're playing both sides.
No, I'm
That's
not.
Well, I'm just saying that's what
Then
it looks like to me.
I am
Because
seeking the
you're
endorsement.
asking for an endorsement. And from a party perspective, the endorsement means one thing, and the primary means something else, and you're conflating the two.
I'm seeking the endorsement of anyone who wants to support me. If they want to support me in Rochester, fine. If they don't need to. I seek the endorsement of the people of the state of Minnesota. I'm not going to play party games. I have my views. I said my views on the issues. Take it or leave it. I want to help. I got a great job. I don't need this job. I don't want to play party politics. I will tell you my positions. They can endorse me in Rochester or not. I will run in a primary, and if I lose, I'll be perfectly happy. I want to try and help. That's all I want to do here.
Would you,
We need to elect Democrats in every single race in this country this fall.
so that
Whether
answers
it,
yes?
absolutely, I will be voting for Democrats for the United States House and the Senate. That means Angie Craig, and that means both United States senators. And I expect other people elsewhere in the country too. There's only one I got a question about, Senator Menendez in New Jersey. Don't get me going on him. But even him, we have to stand up to Donald Trump.
Okay.
We have to stand up to Donald Trump. There's a reason. I mean, people ask me, would you run as an independent? Some people said you have a much better chance as an independent. I don't care. It's not about whether I'd be a senator or not. There's no way I want this race going to anyone who is going to be beholden to Donald Trump. And that's what's going to happen to current housing. So, that's it. No. I made disagreements with Senator Smith on the issues, but it's nothing like having someone there who's going to kowtow to Donald Trump.
So to be clear, because I understand your question, when you say the endorsement of the people, you're referring to primary.
August.
Yes, you're referring to August.
That's
so
what
I think
happens
there's a lot of confusion that comes up about that, because in DFL circles, when you say endorsement, people hear state convention.
Yeah.
They hear party endorsement coming out of the state convention.
I've made it very, very clear that I'm going to a primary in August. I may go in there with a lot less money, because I will not take PAC money. Will not have it. But I think that it is fundamentally undemocratic to ask candidates to so-called abide by the endorsement. It's just wrong.
And to make sure, because the question was asked quietly, I thought it was a very important question to make sure that camera gets it and people in the back hear it. The question was, if you do not win the primary in August, will you be voting for Tina Smith?
100% yes. Absolutely. You want Karen Housley in there? You want Donald Trump controlling one of our Senate seats?
In the back, in the middle.
I would be.
Oh, that was you. You moved up. Okay, sorry.
Sorry. So I am a state delegate, and the idealist in me just, is thrilled with your candidacy. I'm really excited. I think you have great plans and great thoughts for what you would do if you are elected. I am concerned, kind of more on the realist side of me, is how are you going to take on these political machines? Getting through the primary is one thing, but then we've got the Republican Party's coming after us, and this is not a seat we thought we were going to have to defend before. So are you ready for the job to be the candidate? Can you tell me a little bit about that?
I think I'm ready. I'm not going to take PAC money, though. Not going to do it. I don't want to be beholden to anybody. And I'll tell you that what I would do as a candidate is go to the people and say, what kind of senator do you want? Do you want somebody who's going to look out after your own interests? And let's talk about health care and single-payer health care. There are a lot of people who think of themselves Republicans and conservatives who, when you explain the fundamental economics of our healthcare system, will understand why we need something different and why we need single payer. And I believe I can talk to a lot of people that it may be difficult for you to talk to if you've been in the Democratic Farmer Labor Party for a long time, talking to a lot of the same people. I can talk to independents, Republicans, explain to them what's wrong with Trump, why we need single payer, why everybody should be on board about protecting the environment. When you go up to the boundary waters, canoeing, doesn't matter whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or an independent, maybe you want to have clean water. That's part of our heritage in this country and in this state. I think I can reach out to a lot of people in a general election with a powerful message.
Do you know your win number, or do you know people who can help you figure out your win number? I think maybe that's, I'm wondering tactically, do you know what to do to get elected?
I believe I do, but I can't predict whether I win or lose. I'm not going to say that I, be able to, if Karen Housley wants to come in there with a couple $1 million, what the result's going to be. But I'm going to take my case to the people. And I believe that the people of this state are going to reject that kind of politics, where big money is determining who our next senator is. I have a lot of faith in the people in this state. I think I'll win. And I think I'll win because I have the right message. That's what people want. They don't want someone who's beholden to party operatives who says they'll abide by the endorsement. They want the PAC money, or they're saying, well, I'm for this copper nickel mine, but not for that copper nickel mine because a retiring congressman from the 8th district says, I don't know, no more games with me. And I happen to think the majority of the people in this state are going to support me.
Was it Krista? Yeah. And then
So earlier you said that when it comes to issues like abortion and marriage equality, that it's really not the government's business. I heard you say that a few different times. So that's a very libertarian kind of answer. And I wonder, when does it become a government issue? When does it actually become a human right to you? That some of these issues really do need governance because human rights are being trampled upon. Are you saying that you would abstain from those votes? Are you saying that you might not show up for those votes? Or are you saying it's not the government's business unless somebody's human right is?
What is the specific issue we're talking about?
A woman's right to decide what happens to her own body. Sometimes there's government decisions that impose upon those rights. And for a lot of libertarians will step back and say, well, it's not the government's business, and therefore that kind of dismisses their responsibility to actually step up and say it's the government's business to say the government does not have a say in that. So there's a difference between saying it's not the government's business and yes, you are imposing on these people's human rights to be able to get married and love who they love, or to be able to do what they want with their own bodies. Therefore, I am going to stand up and vote against this bill.
Well, I think that who you want to marry is your own business. You know, we can debate if that issue is should you be able to marry your own sibling in certain situations where I think there is a reasonable government interest in saying no. But you're being willing to marry, wanting to marry someone, and the government saying you cannot marry them because they're the same sex is just wrong. That's not the government's business. So that's where I am on that one.
So I
So,
think what she's saying is you would vote to protect that right.
Would you cast a vote to protect those rights?
of course, yeah, I mean, to protect
Instead
the.
of just saying, not my business, I don't care.
But the point is that when you say it's not the government's business, so the government has a law that says you can't marry someone because they're the same sex. I went in front of the legislature of the state of Minnesota and testified in front of the House and the Senate saying it's none of the government's business. And the government should not have that law. The law should be repealed and replaced with a law that allows you to marry the person of your choice, regardless of the sex of the person
So
of your
you're
choice.
saying you would make that vote to
Absolutely.
to get the government out of that.
To get the government out of telling you, well, you can't marry someone you want to marry because of their sex, just like the Commonwealth of Virginia a number of decades ago said you can't marry someone you love because of their race. But to me, that is a government inserting itself in a personal decision that is not the government's business when you have such laws. And so such laws ought to be repealed. Absolutely.
Right over there.
Thank you for sticking your neck out, Mr. Boehner. I have, one thing that hasn't been talked about tonight is the large expenditures on the military and the incessant, I don't know, adulation, if you will, that's going on within the administration, relating to the NFL and all that other kind of happy crap. What's your position on funding the military in a monetary way?
Yeah, I'll talk about the military and then go to the NFL here.
That's handed.
You know, there was a day when there was a Republican president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who said that we had a military-industrial complex that could get out of hand and you know, dominate spending and get us into a lot of wars. That was his farewell address in 1961. It's gotten a lot worse because now we have the PACs and the super PACs that the defense industry finances. They get what they want in Washington. I saw that firsthand when I was in the Bush administration because they'd have all these events and invite White House officials. Defense spending is out of control. Part of it is the defense industry that President Eisenhower warned against. The other part of it is the move toward interventionism, whether it is what happened in Vietnam, on a much smaller scale when President Clinton wanted to get into Kosovo without going to Congress, and then of course with President George H.W. Bush in Iraq with a limited engagement, and George W. Bush with a much more extensive invasion of Iraq, which was of course much more expensive than we were told it would be, and so forth. We need to pull back there. We cannot be running around the world policing the world. We've got enough problems here at home, and that's what we ought to deal with. And it's a serious issue as to how much we want to be spending on our defense budget when it's not just for defense. A lot of it is really offense. We're trying, you may have noble objectives of exporting democracy to places where it's not going to work, but that shouldn't be the job of our military. So we need to think through what we really can accomplish in the world with military force, and it's not what we think we can. And we need to address what's going on with the so-called military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned about, and deal with the political influence of the defense contractors. Serious problem. The thing with the NFL is just that President Trump thinks that he ought to be able to tell people where to stand or kneel during the national anthem, and he's persuaded these NFL owners to go along with him. Mostly all billionaires, mostly white guys who are billionaires. Well, my answer to that is really clear, that they ought to pay for their own football stadiums before they start telling people what to do. And I don't know what happened with this stadium here, and why a billionaire is getting a big stadium instead of us investing money in our schools. I think it's a tragedy that happened, and we ought to find out who was responsible for getting us into that mess. But, the idea that people get all those handouts from the government for their stadiums and they're coming along and say that they run around calling themselves the owners as if some sort of plantation, and then saying the players have to stand or whatever during the national anthem. It's ridiculous.
So we've got just till a little bit after 9 here. So I'm just going to, I want a final show of hands. Anybody who still has a question? 1, 2, more over there. So why don't you go ahead?
Hi, I'm Mona Morris, and I'm a delegate as well. And I don't think you addressed net neutrality at all, and I'm very curious to see what you think about net neutrality, but also just the growing dangers of cyber attacks, and how you think that should be addressed for protecting us in Minnesota and just generally in the United States.
Well, the internet's a monopoly, basically. So you treat it like you do any other, monopoly. It ought to be regulated. You can't have a situation where you just buy your way into getting high-speed access. It's going to destroy our democracy too, because then the political campaigns with those most money are going to get the better access. So net neutrality is absolutely critical, not just to a fair and even playing field for commercial markets, but for our political system. So I certainly think Congress ought to move full speed ahead. The problem is the Trump administration doesn't seem to want to cooperate with that. And then what your second question was, about cyber attacks. I mean, this is, we are really defenseless when we don't believe that there are foreign nations trying to infiltrate our political system through computer hacking. And Fox News can say everything they want. This Russia thing is a serious scandal. If we let this happen, it's going to happen again. And it could be the Chinese, it could be anyone else. Our country is extremely vulnerable to computer hacking. And we're not taking it seriously.
Yeah. Well, I don't just mean influencing the election. I mean like holding government ransom or shutting down our power grid or accessing other things, military things.
Yep.
Yeah.
Cyber warfare. Where are we investing in? That's where we ought to be investing our resources. Let's go back to our defense budget. Instead of more, whatever it is Lockheed wants to deliver, more airplanes. We're not focusing on where the real threats are. And that's definitely one of them. Biological warfare and cyber warfare.
Can I ask a second question by net neutrality?
Oh,
I
yeah.
know that Senator Franken was a big champion also of our privacy on the web, and I'm wondering if you would continue on that mission if you got his seat.
Absolutely. I think we should do everything to protect privacy on the web. When they gather information on you, when you do searches, and then that information is sold to people, which, by the way, political campaigns are getting it, so they're in on the racket too. It's a big problem, and there's not very much transparency with respect to how much information is being gathered on you by Google and by other search engines, and then be distributed. It's a serious problem. I would support what Senator Franken was doing. I'm sure Senator Smith would as well. I want to narrow the areas of disagreement between myself and Senator Smith to areas where we really definitely disagree. And so I think I would definitely want to carry forward, though, with what Senator Franken was doing.
So we are almost out of time. I just want to mention real quick, I am going to be doing another interview similar to this one with Mr. Painter tomorrow night. So if you have questions, and that's actually going to be at Rasmussen College, IREB is running that one. If you have any questions that you did not get asked tonight, come find me when we're done, and I will add them to the list tomorrow to make sure we get them. That one's going to be filmed as well and posted online. But the last question of the night is going to go right back there.
Well, I apologize because my question has more to do with the ongoing investigation, which I feel is something that obviously hangs over the top of all these important issues that we're talking about. Recent reports have shown that there was a potential of an interview that was supposed to take place in January. There's also been reports that have talked about a potential subpoena. What's your take on why it's transitioned to this point, and why charges are being brought forward, and what do you think the play on that is as it pertains to the next handful of months?
I think only Bob Mueller knows why he's doing what he's doing. I think he has he wants to do what's right within his mandate, which is to focus on criminal activity in connection with the Russia interference with the election. I would not anticipate that he's gonna be doing a lot of things on the eve of the election. He's not gonna pull a Jim Comey and write some silly letter, to the House Oversight Committee. It's gonna be put up on the internet. What a disaster that was. But I think he's gonna behave responsibly, and there may very well be more indictments. The president says he'll talk to Bob Mueller and then pulls back on that. I think there's gonna have to be a subpoena, but we probably would not have with that interview. We would not get that probably till next January or later, because the president's gonna drag that through the courts if there's a subpoena. I don't think he wants to honestly talk to Bob Mueller, because Bob Mueller will nail him very, very quickly. I want to say, though, that we owe this investigation into Bob Mueller continued independence, in part to Senator Al Franken, because I remember the history of that. When Senator Franken asked the right questions of Jeff Sessions about Russians, I remember Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, lied, and Al Franken caught him in a lie and had the courage to go on national television and say it was a lie, very close to perjury. I then, the next day, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times saying Jeff Sessions should resign. Senator Jeff Sessions did not resign, but he then decided to recuse from the Russia investigation. So he was shamed into that because he got caught in a lie by Senator Franken. I don't think he cared what I had to say, but he did care that the United States Senate, they nailed him on lying about his contacts with the Russians. And that's why it makes all the difference who's sitting on those committees and asking the questions. You can't sit there being passive. Not when you're dealing with these liars. You got to ask them the right questions, pin them down, and then when you find out they lied to you, you got to have the courage to call them out on that. And that's what Senator Franken did. And if that hadn't happened, Jeff Sessions might not have recused, and might very well we might not have Bob Mueller. So it does make a difference who's in the legislature. We just need more people who are willing to do the right thing in both the House and the Senate.
Thank you.
Thank you for giving a round of applause to both Professor Painter and Adam. Great job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much.